Konnichiwa.
روز بخیر.
Good afternoon.
I'm Megumi. I'm from Tokyo.
I'm Minsky. I'm living in Tokyo. I'm from Tehran.
I'm Gemma. I'm from Australia and I am in Tokyo.
This is the final episode of Movement for Room 303 Radio, a 6-part series that examines resistance to the status quo and confronts long-standing injustices in the places we call home, from Tokyo to Tehran.
In today's episode, we're talking about moments of movement, times when revolutionary tactics have worked or revolutionaries have broken through or movements have mobilized successfully, plus what has worked in the past.
And obviously all forms of protest are needed to affect change. People who theorize on this call it a diversity of tactics. So that's boycotts, peaceful demonstrations, direct action, legal challenges, and all that kind of stuff. But often, to be effective, protest needs to be strategic and it needs to be unexpected and it needs to be maybe even obscure to like force the opposition into unfamiliar terrain. And I guess last week we were having a conversation with somebody who has been very involved with the community in Okinawa who are protesting the US military bases. And he was saying that understandably, completely justifiably, Okinawan people are so tired and they're exhausted of having protested this for so long without really getting anything other than some money in reparations. And he was saying that like people still go and protest outside of the base, but it's almost like a routine where once they get dragged off, they don't run back or anything, obviously because they don't want to get arrested or whatever. But yeah, it is an interesting thing with like such a changing world now, how older forms of protest aren't necessarily as effective. And like, you know, I remember reading this interview with a cop in LA and he was talking about how like police know how to manage a 10,000 person protest very easily. And like, yes, it chews up police resources, blah, 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 which is good, obviously. But they know how to manage it. Whereas he was like, if those 10,000 people split into 10 1,000 people protests and scatter themselves across the city, we'd be fucked. Like we wouldn't know what to do. So yeah, just like that idea, I suppose, of like trying to get them in a way that they're not expecting or can't handle.
I guess, sorry. Even thinking about it in that way of you mentioning like chewing up police resources is even one tactful way. As somebody who doesn't attend so many protests, honestly, if anything, none, I think in my life, that's a very interesting way of like reframing and looking at it, even the most conventional ways, which is like the Okinawans people like standing in front of a gate and just saying no to base. Even that is a form of, okay, we have to go to the gates and like say no, you can't be around here, all that. Like that is even in some way of form, while it's still traditional, and let's say how much of an effect is it having materially, I can see how it is in a way of like resistance. And like, yeah, that is a good, I was like, oh wow, okay, I didn't know that is also a way of looking at it. So yeah.
Yeah, right? Like just a thorn in the side. Yeah. And like eventually, hopefully the thorn in the side gets so great that demands are met. But yeah.
Sorry. Marina.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think there are, you know, I always debated with myself and friends about the personal cost that we pay for certain protests or certain movements and the effectiveness of that. And I think that becomes a huge question, especially when governments or a lot of oppressive not only regime systems, they coordinate and they have like a playbook. But like when we think about activism or opposition, our playbook tends to be very famously protest, and as we talked about, certain things we do. Like there's this quote by Arundhati Roy, like from India. I really love her work. She says, "Can the hungry go on a hunger strike? Nonviolence is a piece of theater. You need an audience. What can you do when you have no audience? People have the right to resist annihilation." And she said that in different contexts, one for India, one about the Palestinian movement one time. And I think that really sheds light on, like if you're hungry already and you're struggling with that, like what would you do? How would you do it?
Yeah.
Also, going back to just briefly from that quote, and also from the Okinawans, and just in general of how I think, to my understanding, how Japanese people protest, it's, I think, quite non-creative, I guess, in the form of what we say, what is a creative way of protesting and traditional way of protesting. And I don't recall if that person last week mentioned this in the snippet that we published last week, but there was a comment, I think, about like, yes, about being performative in a sense that like, yes, every week, every day they go into a certain place and like they just say no base, and that's kind of it. But I'm also like, I can also understand that that's how Japanese people protest, and that's kind of the only forms that we know how. Like, I guess we were earlier mentioning this, but like, I can't imagine Japanese people kind of like, I don't know, in a form of, let's say, feminism movement, let's say, that they will, you know, that protest of like that marathon running, a woman once like just bled or something to protest that I'm like on my period, but I'm bleeding. I can't imagine that being visible in Japan, for instance, that is a form, let's say, quote unquote, extreme protesting. So culturally speaking, I know there's a bunch of layers to this, but I think there's a lot to think about, and like there's context to it to say that like, yes, we need more forms and ways to protest cleverly as well too. But also I'm like, damn, is there an alternative way for Japanese people to be more like extreme and creative in a way? Because I can't kind of imagine it, sort of.
It's interesting. Like, I think I absolutely agree with that. And one example of a good example I can think of is the Shiori Ito case, where she tried, like, she was raped and by a very powerful journalist, and she exhausted all her legal options, right? And then she ended up getting, just by persevering and continuing her case legally, and also talking about it, writing it. She wrote a book about it. She later on recently did a movie about it that was Oscar nominated for, I think, Best Director. I'm not sure, but like, that medium of protest or movement for herself and other women, I thought is so powerful, because it's exactly like, you know, in Japan, or the old school thinking, I think same in Iran, as a woman, to be like saying what was done to me was wrong, and to make a scene or being loud is by itself considered not so nice, not so ladylike. Or like, I saw videos of this woman waiting for Shiorito outside a courtroom, be like, why do, like, shouting at her, be like, why do you need attention? Why do you, it's like she was really like bothered by her having the spotlight. But I thought that her medium or her way of doing it was exactly like both sending that message, but also doing it exactly where it hurts, of being in the center of attention, making it like creating a scene out of it, as opposed to like doing like a silent strike, or like sitting next to a court, or like, you know, maybe she did those too, but I think what really moved the needle was that attention or spotlight.
So true. And that has been a really interesting thing with Me Too style movements around the world, is that like, yeah, women haven't had access to legal protections for this sort of stuff. So they've had to like go to the media or write a story about it or whatever. And yes, they try and like circumvent defamation laws to do so. But it's had so much success. On your point, Minsky, earlier about like, how can you go on a hunger strike when you're already hungry? And on your point, Megumi, also about like creative protest in a country where people aren't necessarily feeling like they could break the law. I guess on Mitsuki's comment, it's like a good incentive to always be protesting for others as well, when like, okay, they can't necessarily do it, but we could do it for them. But then something that I've been like reading about recently, because Minsky lent me this book, was about ways of protesting within the law. And like an example that sort of ties into both was, there was an airport in the States in the 60s, and the janitors were being really, really grossly underpaid. So the janitors went on strike. But the janitors striking was maybe not quite enough to propel the airport to pay the people more. So they got involved with some organisers who were like, okay, a whole bunch of activists are going to storm the airport and they're going to lock themselves in all the toilets so that like everybody getting off an airplane is going to be so busting and they can't go to the toilet and ultimately they're going to have to piss in the airport. And technically like it's kind of not that illegal. All they're doing is occupying the bathrooms, these activists. And they didn't even end up having to do the action because they just sort of cleverly leaked it to the media that it was going to happen. And the airport was like, shit, we can't even allow that to happen. We better pay these janitors more. So yeah, I guess that's just an example of like a protest within the law that others were mobilizing to help the janitors with because the janitors didn't quite have enough power on their own.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is in the 60s?
Yeah, in the 60s.
And this is pre-smartphones. So
Yeah.
I guess like telling that through media is like by literally telling people, like journalists being like, hey, this is happening. So
Right.
like word of mouth.
Yeah. And mobilizing people through leaflets. And like another example that actually did go to plan, in the town of Rochester in New York, Kodak, like the film company, came and they're like the biggest employer. They like took over the town, all of the problems that happened with the big company. And they had really discriminatory hiring processes and they weren't hiring black people. And so because it was difficult to like target Kodak directly when they didn't really have the power to, like they're not employed, they can't strike, what could they do? The people, again, mobilized and were sort of like, okay, what if we pressure other people who shop for Kodak or work at Kodak and get them to put the pressure on Kodak? So like heaps of members of the black community organized to go to a department store in the town. And because it was, again, the 60s and like still super racist, the department store was like, oh, we're going to have to get so much extra security and have so much extra police. And like a white person walking into a department store where there are just like 1,000 black people standing around and shopping awkwardly all day is going to be like a really difficult thing to manage. And they actually did do that and it was legal because you can't stop someone going to a store. And enough pressure was put on Kodak so that they changed their hiring policies like really quickly. Yeah,
That's
so just
super
that
smart.
idea of protesting within the law, which I'm imagining has to happen in Iran as well under such a strict regime that people have to be so creative but still operating within the legal bounds.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one huge problem in Iran is that because the rule of law changes as like the government wishes, depending on like any sort of pressure you put on them through civil disobedience, or they can also like come up with a new way to go after you or your family. So it's like a very fluid thing that people are trying to maneuver. So it goes even beyond that. Like I don't think we could do the strikes that way, or we could even like they would like come with a gun if you're like taking the bathroom in an airport. Like that's not.
Yeah,
but
right.
there were cases which I heard were genius like ideas, and some of them were done well. Like I think very early on, similar to what we hear about the boycotts of, let's say, industries that support Israel. For example, we had multiple years ago, people started fully understanding which of our companies, despite being quote unquote private, are connected to the military arm that last time I mentioned that they have a lot of industries under their belt. And on internet, there was always a picture of these normal products. It could be dairy products or whatever, like a big meat kind of brand or all these different things. And people would put like an alternative that they were like, we didn't find anything suspicious about this other brand. So if you have a choice, if you go to supermarket, buy this, don't buy that. This boycotting was really cool. The other thing I heard, which was really cool, but unfortunately, I think people got a little bit scared because they're worried about their finances and money, was that certain days they decided not to use the credit. We don't have such thing as credit card. There's debit card in Iran that people use to pay for things, and it's very normal. Like rarely you use cash. Like recently I have not seen people using cash, but they were deciding that on some certain time windows or days, nobody would use cards to pay for things because that would hurt these banks that are actually the biggest way for government for corruption, and they're like wash money and they do a lot of things. So basically when people go after where it actually hurts, which is money always, even in a like an oppressive regime that makes religion as its main point, but that actually it's running on money. That really does hurt. And you can see how like during those boycotting moments, like a lot of these CEOs of these companies were trying to like come online and explain, oh no, this is fully private. They humanize themselves, which was interesting because we never see any other accountability from government. But when it comes to spending, suddenly people are trying to like fight back through marketing, which is the first time I saw any sort of response in that regard outside violence toward people. So I think
Rationalizing it.
yeah, or like they just pretend that no, this is actually private. It's all like a lie that we are connected to SEPA, which is the military group, or they would like make stories of their work. For example, one other thing they did was like they would bring up stories of the workers to be like, you're hurting the workers, even though you're thinking that you're hurting the government and us. In reality, this is your like, this is like a minimum wage, just like, bro, first of all, why is he getting paid minimum wage? But second of all, don't put that guilt upon us. But it was interesting because there was some sort of response, which was, I think that's by itself progress.
It's heartening because like they wouldn't respond if it wasn't hurting. They wouldn't try and stop it or reverse it or do a propaganda campaign if it wasn't actually getting them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there was one more thing. I don't know if it's okay to mention this, but I really like the protest that comes from the oppressive regime itself when one player or multiple players go rogue. For example, like, I mean, we have a very extreme case who became momentarily a national hero. He was kind of like a cleaner from a very poor financial background in a main court of Tehran. So his job was to bring tea to these judges who would make up political, political like crimes, and then would execute people. So there were two notorious judges in Tehran, more than two, but these two were like the main dudes from early revolutionary times that they would execute a bunch of young people because of political like activity. And they have like the resume they have created is just absolutely sick. And I'm like, how did you have time to execute this many people? It's crazy. Wow. And this guy, the helper, the cleaner guy, he was this young dude, like late 30s. And I don't know how he acquired the gun or who he was connected to. One day, he basically shoots both of these people. He finds this like amazing, like this spot in time and place in that court. And then I think he ends up shooting himself but like, that was crazy. Iran was shook. Like everybody I knew online was so shocked as to, wow, like these are the people we don't even, or a lot of middle class people don't even think about, or their lives. And this person not having anything has become our hero. And the reason he became a hero, I know killing or saying, oh, you should, but these people are like Hitlers of our time. You know, I know, so, but like these people kill you because they don't like that, because of what you think. So that's why I want to add context to the terror that it is. But my point, and then that was an extreme case, but we had other people who within the regime would leak audios that we would never hear, these like people accepting some sort of defeat that they had in like when they were like sending troops to Syria or Lebanon or against Israel. You hear certain things that I think when I was a kid we would never have access to. But that means there are some people in the regime leaking stuff. Yeah. Which is great. Like
it's so great. It's so great. Wow. Like the worker, like the person serving tea who shot them, that it almost makes more sense to me because like, sure, he's working for the regime, but like as a worker, I'm sure he's treated like shit. He's bringing tea to these monsters who are executing people all day long. But yeah, like the people in the regime leaking is so interesting because it's like, are you compromising your morals by working here and you're just leaking sometimes, or are you like fully just in there to leak? What do you think?
I think people, I think there are all different types of people. I'm sure people have an agenda, but I think a lot of people, including this guy, I mean, later on there was so much discussion around him. People tried to find who he is, what was his background. But the more you read, the more you realize how ordinary these people are. I think they get radicalized. Like I heard this political prisoner, she was a human rights activist. She said like when she was going through her courts, which were absolute sham courts, she said the most heartwarming thing was that exactly these people who were cleaning up or coming to like set up the like whatever chairs and everything would be like, I'm so sorry you're going through this, I'm so sorry, like these people not having any say in this situation. So I think maybe being exposed to these environment, or the leakers, like I think being exposed to what the reality of these organizations are, they get radicalized. Like even in corporate America, like we have a lot of cases of leaking, like Amazon environmental activists. They weren't activists, but they're like, okay, this is wrong what we are doing, obviously, and then they start leaking. So
true. The Boeing person, even was his name Aaron Bushnell, he was in the Air Force who set himself on fire.
Yeah.
And like said so much information about the US involvement in Palestine. I guess like even Luigi Mangione to some extent
sounds very familiar to what Minsky was just explaining.
Right? Like, and he's somebody who wasn't supposed to go rogue. Like he's somebody who the system is designed to benefit. So it is so exciting when somebody like that actually steps off the treadmill and turns against the empire that they are part of.
Yeah. And I think the more difficult that fight becomes, I'm not justifying again violence, but I think so long as we don't have super creative, absolutely impactful methods to fight them, sometimes if like those people are killing your people, like, is it justified? If it's like, I don't know, like I feel like the debate can go on and on, but I don't know. I think in very oppressive regimes, like the despair, you're fighting the despair and you're fighting this regime that there's no winning.
Yes. Yes.
I wonder what the line is. I can't help but mention the assassination of like the prime minister of Japan that happened recently, and like how that man was not at all a national hero. Like he wasn't treated. No one knows his name. Like I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Like you can ask probably 100 Japanese people on the streets in Shinjuku right now. They won't know his name.
Right.
Perhaps.
Do you know his age? Like 20s, 40s?
30s to 40s,
Yeah,
maybe.
right.
Like I don't know anything about. Maybe he was in the like some sort of, what was it? Not military. Maybe like
Ex-defense, like
yeah,
Japan, yeah.
kind of. That's why he was able to like witchcraft his little gun thing or whatever. But yeah, like, but once again, I wonder what the line is there of like heroizing or whatever the word is, like to, in Japan, I guess maybe we aren't as oppressed. So like when something as extreme happens like that, and it doesn't actually becomes like, oh my God, he's our hero, he saved us, he's a savior. There wasn't actually maybe significant, there's always a cause and an effect maybe to these kind of things. And perhaps the difference of what you were giving us, Minsky, was that like there is material effect to people's lives, and by him eliminating those two people, it's like, whoa, yes, you did it. But with us, it's more like, I think we talked about this in whatever episode we were talking about, but then in Japan, when young people are not as involved with politics, and also even young people in general, people not having protests in this country to begin with as well, like it's just kind of like one of the biggest reasons is because people don't think that it's as useful. And also, why should we do anything? Because there isn't anything to even change so much. Yeah, I find that a very interesting contrast of making somebody a hero when something as extreme did happen in Japan as well, just very recently.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like, again, with Luigi, like, I think that lots of rich people didn't think that this was going to make him a hero. Like, and by rich, I mean like super, super rich, like Joe Rogan, for example. But like, I remember just reading in the comments of Joe Rogan, like, you know, decrying Luigi's like assassination or alleged assassination. And like all of Joe Rogan's followers were being like, nah, bro, like this guy was actually maybe on the right side of history. And it's such an interesting example of like people uniting across class and across political beliefs, because as you said, Megumi, like everybody is materially affected by that. So therefore he became like the people's prince. Whereas like the assassination of Abe, like, yeah, not everybody is materially affected by that. So it becomes less of a folkloric thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting one. We have an audio clip of some sort. That
Oh,
what
yeah.
was the thing that
We do.
What is that about though?
Okay, yeah,
The
that's
context
So
introduction.
actually, it's a great segue because we talked about the extreme type of, I guess, making your point.
Yeah,
through.
true.
And then there are, I think, other ways that like a slower movement that can happen either indirectly through, let's say, like COVID happened and a lot of people started working from home. And I think it's my personal experience, and I hear a lot around me, that a lot of people went through this phase that they reconsidered their values or the productivity kind of ethics of productivity, or just taken that as granted as we all should be productive, or work is an ethical thing to do. And to what extent I think the value of family or alone time or being at home were those values were really in the spotlight during COVID, and it definitely changed some of us like fundamentally, that going back to work was never the same. Going back to the office or even doing the same work was never the same. And I think that really pissed a bunch of people off, including the rich, the billionaire class. So we are going to hear some of the one audio leak from Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan. And I heard on a different, like a video, the person who was sharing this leak was like, not the original person, but like one person was saying, just listen not only to what he says, but to the tone tone of what he says. So yeah.
Maybe I've only ripped the audio of one of these, which is not the JP Morgan one.
Okay.
It's the other guy. But
Okay.
while I play this one, I'll get up the JP Morgan one.
Yeah, this guy is another millionaire guy talking about disciplining workers, so we can listen to it.
Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, like as Minsky was saying, it was such an unexpected movement of COVID that like actually really did give workers back a lot of the power that they haven't had for however long, and made employers realize like, yikes, okay, we do actually have to cater to their needs. But yes, as Minsky said, some folk weren't happy.
We're starting to see less arrogance in the employment market, and that has to continue. People decided they didn't really want to work so much anymore through COVID, and that has had a massive issue on productivity. Tradies have definitely pulled back on productivity. They have been paid a lot to do not too much in the last few years, and we need to see that change. We need to see unemployment rise. Unemployment has to jump 40-50% in my view. We need to see pain in the economy. We need to remind people that they work for the employer, not the other way around. There's been a systematic change where employees feel the employer is extremely lucky to have them, as opposed to the other way around. It's a dynamic that has to change. We've got to kill that attitude, and that has to come through hurting the economy, which is what the whole global, the world is trying to do. The governments around the world are trying to increase unemployment to get that to some sort of normality. And we're seeing it. I think every employer now is seeing it. I mean, there is definitely massive layoffs going off. People might not be talking about it, but people are definitely laying people off.
All right, chat amongst yourselves while I get the other one up.
Thank you. But yeah, like this one really, I think it's actually a few years old, but this really pissed people off, this comment, because he's basically saying you should increase unemployment, like asking the government to increase unemployment by 40-50% so that's a disciplinary action against the working class. And this dude, we did some very quick digging. It doesn't take that long. He inherited the money with which he started his real estate business. He's a millionaire. His grandfather was his first boss. So it does hurt me a little bit to hear he wants to discipline the working class.
Oh, classic, yeah. And also this guy owns a biohacking chain of spas in Australia, part of that billionaire class who wants to live forever.
Wow. One of those longevity type guys.
One of those longevity type guys.
Wow.
All right, now we've got the other clip for you. Jamie Dimon slamming work from home.
Yep.
Jamie Dimon.
Oh, first we're getting a Japanese ad. Skip that.
The results are in. Nvidia just reported earnings. The stock was up as much as 4% and also down as much as...
God damn.
Hold on for a second.
Got
We'll
it.
just pull it up.
Come in and where JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon has made it crystal clear. He wants his employees back in the office and he's not backing down. In a bold statement during a town hall meeting, Dimon shut down any talk of flexible work arrangements, work from home policy, and even allegedly fired an employee for questioning the policy. What exactly happened at that meeting? This is the full story. On February 12th, JP Morgan Chase held a town hall meeting with around 1,000 employees, where the topic of the company's strict return to office mandate was front and center. For months, JP Dimon has been vocal about his stance on remote work, insisting that all 317,000 employees return to office 5 days a week starting in February. Dimon has time and again shut down any hybrid or even work from home options. He has been a vocal critique of remote work, claiming that it hurts productivity.
All right, so that is the intro to the story. Thank you, journalist.
Will this work?
Yeah, let's give it a whirl. We're just going to play it through the microphone. There's no auxiliary. Hole in the phone.
It's so important. We have to fight for this.
Wow, our last episode. We love a technical. Oh, damn it.
All right. Well, the gist of it.
The gist of it,
Is-
yeah.
I guess the tone also really kind of matters too, right?
Yeah.
With this one.
Basically, I think the whole point is, which I would love to know if you guys had the same experience, but for me, working in finance, we had a lot of older generation people who had made many, I guess they were so successful financially, and there was this rage and anger against my generation or people younger than me even, that they were like so puzzled by the fact that we are not 100% and only motivated by money. And we cared about other stuff. We cared about the quality of life. We cared about, having other stuff, or like even work wasn't just work. Like people had a view on like how they wanted to make it look. And I remember a lot of times they would, because they're in powerful positions as well, so they're more self-expressive. So they would like, a lot of times you would find the angry tone of Jamie. That was so familiar to me, and I hope people listen to it at some point. But the angry tone of, why aren't you working more? Or why can't I get a hold of you when I want to? I work 7 days a week. Why don't you do that? And like that idea of putting so much ethical and like so much like ethics and morality into you coming to work, especially to a white collar job that's very questionable whether you're making any difference, but still like that's the ethical thing. They fight it as if it's a morality. And I think that says a lot, because these, especially Jamie Dimon and his likes, the billionaire class, when they talk about workers, they're not talking about us, the workers. They're talking about the other class they don't belong to, which makes it really, I think they do want to make it sound like he says, oh, I work 7 days a week, but his work is very different. You know, like these CEOs get paid something around $30 million to $80 million a year in bonus. So that's a very different, point to come to. But there's also one last thing, is that there's a lot of lobbying in the US, for example, by the billionaire class, not to allow universal basic income, because they want our school, our shelter, our like everything basically to depend on your participation in the type of work that is designed by them and by the ruling class. So that's also quite interesting to me, because it's a point of discipline. Like if you have so much debt for your mortgage, just a place to live, you have to make money for your kid to go to school. Debt is actually the biggest disciplinary tool in capitalism, because if you have debt, you cannot move around, you cannot live liberated, like in a liberated fashion. That's what they want. They want like people with high debt and a kind of continuous working schedule.
Yeah, totally. I mean, again, it's like that quote, how can you do a hunger strike when you're starving? Like, how can you take time off work and strike when you are so dependent on what that position is providing you with?
I think it's also so important to note that like when people, like what you were mentioning, Minsky, about like it's just never an equal playing field where he's like talking, when Jamie, somebody like him who has so much money and power, and he talks about my workers or his workers, like, yes, to your point, Minsky, they are never like his 7 days work thing routine is so different from what an average worker has to go through. And like his discussion, it's just not an equal playing field. Like it's just not at the same place. What the discussion is like, perhaps he's probably just going to like business dinners and that's his job.
No, even more than I think he's executing his free will. Like his agency as a billionaire, as a CEO of a global company, he's going, like, imagine one day of like a week, one day, or even like, let's say 1 hour a week, you had the power that he has. Of course, you're going to be so motivated to get up, go to work, change the world, literally in your liking. So I think that's also, but the workers he's talking about, that's not it. That's make the presentation deck for the next investment or whatever, for the next M&A deal, like do this, do that. It's like a white collar, type of job that you need to make your bosses happy. That's completely, I think, like, is just the wrong comparison, wrong class of people, wrong everything. But his anger is real. That's the thing.
His anger is real, but I also just assume that it is possible that he actually does feel like that much of a victim, that he's like, this is an ethical issue. Like, I get out of bed and go to work every day. Why aren't these people? Yeah. But then you also hear people like Jeff Bezos saying like, I want my workers to wake up terrified. And it's like, okay, cool. At least that's a more accurate reflection of how you feel about your workers. You're not trying to be like, it's our moral obligation to work.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, this really reminds me of like, I guess since we're talking about moments of movement, it's a very tiny example of it in a very micro sense. But like, remember quiet quitting on TikTok? That became like big. I feel like this is very similar to that in discussion of like how we look at work differently generationally. And that whole quiet quitting discourse was interesting to me because I also sympathized on the side of being raised in the hustle culture of millennial, and like, yes, you got to wake up from 7 and like work until 9 p.m. and fucking miss your last train and like being stuck in that whole thing and get that money, bitch. Like that whole thing. I grew up on that hustle, and like, I kind of sometimes, it still kind of lingers around me still a little bit. And I think I was a bit, what's the word? Like I was annoyed perhaps by the Gen Z or seeing like, I'm just going to quiet quit and I'm not going to like say anything or do anything at work and just going to show up and like look cute and that's it. And like, I think I was a bit resentful of younger generations kind of acting that way as well too. But yes, like, I guess I don't have sort of a point, but I just remembered that there was in fact but like a tiny trend of some sort of like quiet quitting, and then how that affects generationally. I remember that there was also myriads of publications or publishing articles about like, is this also an ethical thing though, morally? What do we think about this though? Is it right? Is it good to stand for something? Sure, but is it also a morally good thing to do? I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, it's a very interesting topic of like remote work and what you stand for with work and whatnot.
Yeah. And I think that's a great example of a quite creative movement, because ultimately at the end of the day, they're still getting paid, but they're just not doing anything, which is wonderful.
Yeah, true.
But I think it's also shed some light on a lot of these jobs that make it possible for this type of behavior.
Fully lazy girl job.
Yeah, so and I think a lot of white collar jobs are like that. You can totally be making problems that you solve, making your own problems to solve at work, and creating your own KPIs to beat, and Especially these big companies, like, and that bothers these people, because I think the argument from someone like Jeff Bezos or Jamie Dimon is that they want the workers to come in and act on the paradigm of, how do I maximize profit, how do I make more money in this structure. Like, they want creativity. So he actually, the early parts of that conversation makes that usually is cut off from the leak, is he says you cannot get creative if you're like half-assing your work and then you're working from home. Like, you come to work, you go to meetings, you get creative, you get stimulated. And that was something that I kept hearing at work as well, that we didn't have permission to work from home for that reason. So they want this like hungry, like, let's say the perfect employee, hungry, maximizing profit type of, like, making success in their role type of person, who is also creative, who comes up with business ideas. So they want someone like a spirit of an entrepreneur in a white collar job that's actually very mostly political and mostly like, I wouldn't say fully fake, but partially fake. It's like in terms of creating actual value. So I think that contradiction by itself creates those opportunities for like quiet quitting.
Yeah.
If you were like a healthcare worker and be like, I'm just gonna be cute at work, you can't. People are gonna die.
Fully.
They probably don't have enough staff there.
Fully.
So it's not only on the worker. It's like, yeah, these companies, I don't know if they will survive, but I can totally see that if it was an actual, let's say, according to them, free market, or an actual like business that had to make sense with healthy competition that was not blocked through, monopolies and stuff, this wouldn't happen. You wouldn't have that much overhead in the first place. So that goes back on them, that they created this like not so free market, not so competitive like landscape. And then
So
they're
true.
also complaining.
So true. I guess also on like the topic of quiet quitting, it is a very individual protest that only has individual reward. And that is a problem across big tech companies and big finance companies and all that sort of stuff, is that the people who are suffering the most from these companies are the lowest paid workers, like the people serving in the cafeteria or the janitors or whatever. And like, because the most protest that, your everyday office worker is doing is quiet quitting. They're not using their power to fight for those people, and they're getting paid enough to just like sort of coast through.
This isn't a segue at all, probably, but just on the topic of like, I think about, I guess, protests and like movements, just because of this nature of this podcast as well, podcast radio show, that like I have personally never like, I guess, participated in one myself, being in Japan as well. But have you both like participated in any protests in Japan perhaps, or even in your own countries? And like, what was like the difference of that? Even, is there anything in particular that kind of stands out? Like, there was recently like a Palestine one as well too that was happening maybe last year a lot, but did you guys at all participated in any of these?
In Japan, I've been to a couple of the like protest raves that have happened. And like, again, I guess that's a creative tactic that the organizers of that have employed to try and attract young people who would not typically be interested in protest to come to something by being like, it's also a rave, which is cool. But yeah, I've been to lots of Palestine protests in New York and also in DC. And like the energy of those are just so incredible. And like, I guess because the communities are so diverse and united, you have like, little kids singing beautiful songs, or you've got like old rabbis making beautiful speeches, or like I participated in one that was like me and a bunch of others like dressed as healthcare workers and had our like hands zip tied and like kneeled on the ground for hours, like as a sort of stage protest sort of thing. And then same in Australia, like the Palestine movement and like the Aboriginal sovereignty movement have really connected. And so those protests have also been really huge. And I guess like different to the Japan one in scale, in diversity, and in like mobilization too. Like I haven't really noticed a police presence around the protests in Japan, whereas like in Australia, so over-policed. In the US, like psycho over-policed. Like organizers get arrested, lose their jobs, like all that sort of stuff.
Even though those protests in the US or Australia are a peaceful
Yep,
protesting,
100%.
right?
And they're technically legal, but like what
yeah.
is legal is a grey area when it comes to what is policed. Yeah.
To my understanding, I guess in Japan, what is not, you need to get like the LGBTQ parades that happens every June on Pride Month. Like I've seen those, and like I've been to like the whatever part, like in Yoyogi or whatever, but that one, I guess you need a permit from the police office or whatever in order to like walk. But I guess those types is what, to my understanding, you need a permit if you're walking around the public streets with protest signs. So when Black Lives Matter was also happening a lot in Japan, I think that was also, I remember cop cars were like behind and in the front, but absolutely. I mean, this is Japan as well too, like very, very peaceful. But again, if you're on public streets, I guess you need cop permission, basically. But if it's protests like in front of the Shinjuku station, for instance, where a bunch was happening during the Palestine movement, I think that is no permit obviously needed. I think people just like joined through social media. But I found that interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of concerned about this permission thing because depending on the political environment or what people are protesting, whether Japanese government is neutral to it or they don't like it, they might use that against. Like I know, I mean, it's not completely related to Japanese government, but there were a lot of protests by Iranians here during the actual protest in Iran. But what Japan police did, not only we had to get permission for that, there were you had to have two main organizers, and then they gave the embassy of Iran, which is literally an arm of like intelligence, like they spy on Iranians elsewhere, like the names of the organizers of the protest. One of my friends was one of the organizers, and Iranian embassy made sure she felt so threatened to ever go back to Iran. Like they they did what they could to retaliate. I mean, not so much because she's in Japan, but I know like it's so unsafe. But like Japanese police not only wanted that, they submitted it to the subject of protest, which I find very weird. And I think if one day, I hope it never happens, but if let's say we have like a point to make or a protest to make against some policies of the government of Japan, what does that mean then?
Right.
They can totally come after you.
Yeah.
And being anonymous is very important, I think, when it comes to actual important protests.
Yes.
Or what actually is like very sensitive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally. And like, I remember reading this thing that was like, what was it? It was sort of talking about how like, make out like you're bigger than you are, and if you have to do it in secret, make out like you're this big anonymous, like extremely threatening group or whatever, to find ways to do it creatively. I guess it is almost time to wrap up, and then we'll go out with a song as per usual. Any closing remarks about movement?
Hopeful movement.
Actually, I just realized one. I saw videos of like cities in Iran where people certain hours at night on certain days would just shout "death to dictator," like from their home. It's like big buildings, right? So it's hard to know whose voice was that. Go and find out. And then you would hear, there are like so many videos of it that people are like shouting out of their windows, and then you see this like collective sense of like, we all fucking hate these people, hate the government. That really like warms up my heart.
That is so heartwarming. And those other symbolic protests that you were talking about when we were talking about this episode earlier, of like just powerful things that, women not wearing hijab in public in a way that gets blown up on social media, and like the hope that can spark in people as well.
Absolutely.
I guess for me, it will be like, because in the context of living in Japan, and again, because it doesn't happen so often, and maybe Minsky, you mentioned this about the power of social media in a sense in some episode. But yeah, the existence of social media is so tricky these days to like justify it, you know, with like the world of AI, and like to know that like, is this real? Is this not? And like people obviously weaponizing it, and like fucking the recent Trump post of like fucking not even wanting to mention what he posted recently. Like, it's tricky for me morally to just kind of like, I hate social media so much. I hate digital so much, honestly. But also knowing how my Japanese peers are, I think, participating in politics when it's really kind of not as visible in Japan. I know that they do boycott, like for instance, like this is a company that supports Israel, so like let's not buy stuff from this company and whatever. There are so many like resources and accounts out there that I know a lot of my Japanese friends, my Western friends, like I know that they already, foreign friends already are like on it. So like I'm not even like looking so much with that, but like when it comes to my Japanese friends, I'm like, yeah, okay, so they are aware, and like they have resources of this kind of stuff, and like they are participating it in a way, and yeah, even just participating in demos and protests, which I haven't done, and there are actually a few that are happening at a micro level, let's say. But yeah, the existence of social media and people kind of participating it through that is hopeful, I would say.
Yeah. And like, I mean, not going to a protest doesn't mean that you're not able to get involved in activism. Like so many people can't go for all sorts of different reasons, whether it's like their own safety or accessibility or like time or whatever. But yeah, like for all of its like failures, social media has been instrumental in like heaps of uprisings in the past, like the Arab Spring or like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, all that sort of stuff. And it is a cool, accessible way for people to get involved.
Yeah. What would be your
my hopeful takeaway? Well, I can use this as a segue to move towards our song, but hairs in my mouth. Cat hairs in my mouth. One of my favorite things is looking over at Minsky while she's talking, and she'll often be like stroking her whiskers.
Stroking it. I will miss that scenery, actually.
I'm embracing this new
It's
phase.
quite like now, like it's like, what is it called? Like it's very straight. Her hairs.
Yes.
To my liking.
Yeah, taste it nicely. But yeah, basically in 1966 on a cattle station in Australia in the Northern Territory, Wave Hill Cattle Station, a bunch of Aboriginal men, and probably women as well, were working on this, and they were like, we need better money, we need better working conditions, like this is fucked. So they walked off the land and engaged in a strike. And it was led by a fella called Vincent Lingiari, who was a Gurindji man. Yeah, poor working conditions and wages, but like at the time and still, Aboriginal people didn't really have any land rights. And this, what was initially a strike, turned into a land rights movement over many years that like finally ended when not only did they get their land back, but they even got the cattle station that they were working on back as their land. And Paul Kelly, who is an Australian singer, wrote a song about it that is like From Little Things, Big Things Grow, that you may have heard. I don't know how much Australian sort of music filters into Iran and Japan. But there is a Wik man called Ziggy Ramo, who is an Aboriginal artist who's like really prolific now. He'd be in his 20s, I suppose. And he reworked that song in 2021 to link like that situation of like these workers striking and eventually getting some land rights to like broader Indigenous struggles for sovereignty and justice. And yeah, just the unfinished fight for Aboriginal land rights in Australia. So I thought we could potentially go out on that song.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Sounds beautiful. Righto. You've been listening to Movement. We'll be back with another season at some point in the future. All right. Let me do this correctly.
Gather round people and I'll tell you a story. 200 years of history that's falsified. British invaders that we remember as heroes. Are you ready? to tell the other side. We start our story in 1493 with a piece of paper called the Doctrine of Discovery, invoked by Pope Alexander VI. Without this good Christian, our story don't exist.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
Captain James Cook, he boarded a fleet, and he was armed with the doctrine of discovery. The same tactics were used by Columbus. It's how today Australia claims terra nullius, 'cause on that paper the Pope did write that you're only human if you've been saved by Christ. And if there are no Christians in sight, the land you stumble on becomes your God-given right.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
Is that your Lord? 'Cause that's invasion. That's the destruction of 500 nations. The genocide of entire populations, which planted the seeds for the stolen generation and grew into my people's mass incarceration. Now we pass trauma through many generations. The Lord can't discover what already existed. For 200 years, my people have resisted.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
The war's continued since Captain James Cook. And this side of history you don't write in your books. You don't want the truth and you don't want to listen. But how can you stomach Australia's contradiction? 'Cause we went to war in 1945. We were allies against a terrible genocide. And I know it's uncomfortable, but the irony I see is that you fall for them, but you don't fight for me.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
We should move on. Move on to what? I still remember. Have you forgot that Vincent Langari knew others were rising? Gurindji inspired us to keep on fighting. So call it Australia. Go on, call it what you like. I just call it how I see it, and I see genocide. Now that you hear me, can you understand? There will never be justice on our stolen land.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
This is the story of so-called Australia, but this is the story of so much more. How power and privilege cannot move my people. We know where we stand. We stand in our law.
From little things, big things grow. 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 things grow. From little things, big things grow.